So good morning, everyone. I'm very honored that UNESCO gave me the role of moderator this morning, and I hope my English will be up to the task. If not, I will go on in French, so don't worry. I have planned to say some words before giving the floor to our speakers, but Lynn told them, and much better than me. So, and as she said, we imperatively have to keep to the schedule, as some of us have their return flight at the beginning of the afternoon. So never mind, I will say thank you to Daya and Leila and all his colleagues for the organization of this seminar. The presentation we were lucky enough to have yesterday gave rise to some very rich exchanges with the speakers, and they also enable us to develop or question our own knowledge about AI. So we'll continue our socio-cognitive itinerary this morning with 3 presentations, and that will more focus on teachers and teacher practices, classroom practices. But before these 3 presentations, after Malik Galab yesterday morning, we are very honored to welcome this morning our second keeper, ManosAntoninis. Manos, look. Yeah, led to the floor. Manos has been the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report since 2017, having been previously responsible for the monitoring section of the report, and coordinating the financing gap estimates for the 2030 education targets, the projection, the achievement of universal primary and secondary education completion.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really sorry to have missed the chance to interact with you yesterday, but I'm also grateful for the opportunity you have given me to exchange with you. For me, it was a great chance to discuss with a group of people who are so influential, and yet we often struggle a little bit to reach out. So I see this as a great opportunity to establish a relationship. So allow me to start with just a couple of slides so that you know where I'm coming from. What is the link? As we know, and Lynn expressed it also very, very powerfully, we're all fearful of expressing views on issues that are as cutting edge as that. So we all need to be humble and recognize where we're coming from, what our contribution to this debate is. So I'm the director of a report that exists now for 22 years. But most of you would probably not know about it, even though it has quite a grand title as the Global Education Monitoring Report. In fact, it started as the Education for All Global Monitoring Report. And its role is to monitor progress on education in the international development agenda. Now, for you, the development agenda has been until recently not particularly relevant, because with development usually we thought of developing countries, low and middle income countries. But after 2015, we have now a universal agenda that also covers education, and that's where this report also has become more relevant for you, and that's what I'll try to explain. What is particularly unique for our report, and I don't have the time to go into detail why this is the case, is that we are an editorially independent report, and you know how rare it is these days to have such a particular status. We are hosted and published by UNESCO, but the report is not written by UNESCO for particular reasons. The international community at the time needed a more independent voice, and you know, UNESCO is an intergovernmental organization with some constraints over what it can and cannot say. But there was a bold movement at the time of much more faith in multilateralism to establish a report of this kind. But as I mentioned, in 2015, there was quite a pivotal moment, because the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was introduced, and what was originally an experiment was considered as a good basis to continue in monitoring the international education goals, what we know as SDG 4 in education, to 2030. And we have a twin mandate to monitor progress on education. There is an SDG 4 monitoring framework with global and thematic indicators. So there's always a discussion of the quantitative aspects of progress. But there's also a mandate to monitor the implementation of national and international strategies to achieve SDG 4. And that's why each one of our reports has a theme. And you see at the bottom, you can't see, but you can see, you will see if you go to the site, the theme that we have covered since 2015. We started with education and the other development goals. We look at the issue of accountability in education. Then we had the issue of migration and displacement, inclusion, the role of non-state actors. And in 2023, the theme was technology, and that's the link with my presence here, because we reviewed how countries approach technology in education, including artificial intelligence. Before I start the presentation on technology and AI, you see the last observation there is that we're more than just a report, and this image on the right is just to say that we do many more things than just a global report which appears every year and a half. By the way, the next report is going to be launched at the meeting of the G20 education ministers, and the global education meeting will be side by side in Brazil at the end of October, beginning of November. And the theme is leadership in education at all levels, from school all the way to political and non-government leadership. But as you see, we have a lot of activities, regional, thematic, online. But we also have a very important role that I wanted to bring to your attention on the development of SDG 4. And there is a very particular process that I wanted you to be aware and establish some contact. In 2015, at the beginning of the SDG 4 era, countries committed to set national targets. One of the big problems of international agendas has been the fact that there's a set of aspirational goals that are very, very high level, and often not very relevant for the majority of countries, because not everyone can achieve universal education, universal learning, universal everything. So in partnership with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, the report has been supporting countries to make that a reality. And given that you are mostly from EU member states, this is a process that maybe many of you would be familiar. The EU, in its 2020 and now 2030 agenda, has benchmarking indicators, which are, of course, for the Union member states to achieve. We could not apply that at a global level. So essentially, this is a development of the EU approach, but with national targets. Countries are encouraged to set national targets for 7 indicators initially. But maybe some of you heard that in 2022 there was a big summit at the UN level, convened by the UN Secretary General, the Transforming Education Summit. And it brought 3 issues more to the attention of the international community that maybe were not sufficiently emphasized before: digital transformation, greening education, and youth participation. And we're currently working, we have already introduced a connectivity indicator, but we're now working on a greening education indicator on green curricula that will be launched later this month, at the beginning of June. And that will be of interest, because it's very similar in some ways in thinking also about digital transformation. And youth participation, we're just discussing with Brooke earlier, that will be another opportunity to see how young people are involved in education policy making around the world. So that's just a very, very brief. I mentioned there, it's in collaboration with the European Commission, because 3 of the 7 original indicators are also EU 2030 indicators. Early childhood participation, early school leaving, which we call secondary completion, and learning at the end of lower secondary, which for Europeans, of course, is primarily linked to PISA, but not in other parts of the world, but at the same global level. So here we have been exchanging with the European Commission, which has been supportive of this, so that there is collaboration, coherence between the national, the regional, and the global. And we have as of last year, this is the 2nd edition of a monitoring report that focuses specifically on the probability that countries have to achieve their national targets. And that's quite a novel way of reporting on progress. Enough with this long introduction, because time is limited. So I was very, very, I have to say, concerned that after the first day with rich discussions, what would I add? I was encouraged by Lynn's introductory word that I'm not going to say perhaps something radically new, but I think my presentation is probably going to echo and strengthen the points, because these were exactly the concerns that we had. remember my introduction, we're a global report. We're not a report that looks into the future. We try to avoid that because there are many other people who can do that. We're more interested into the present. And given that we cover countries between those that have no electricity, there are countries with no electricity in the schools whatsoever. And there are countries, of course, that apply facial recognition. So we have to speak to all of those contexts. So we always try to take a back step and see things the way we understand them as we try to conceptualize it in our heads. So technology is changing, but contrary to what many people often say, we believe it's not yet transforming education. Yes, technology has grown rapidly. Just an indicative number, these massive open online courses were enrolling just already a couple of years ago, 220 million students, and that excludes China, by the way, in the statistics. That's the same number as the number of students enrolled in tertiary education. So it's and that's something that happened in 10 years. Of course, not everyone participates in the same way, but it shows the magnitude. And yet, at the same time, these opportunities are not open to everyone, and there are massive inequalities. Not thinking just of digital, but any distance learning was not available for 72% of the poorest 20% of the world's population during the pandemic, just to give you an indication. And that's not only digital. But before the pandemic, this graph reminds us also that even though we talk about the use of technology being widespread everywhere, in reality, just before the pandemic, that's the 2018 PISA statistics, only 1 in 10 students were exposed to a device for more than an hour in science and mathematics in their classes. So it's a much less intensive participation than often we are led to believe if you read the news. There were, of course, 3 exceptions: Denmark, Sweden, and Australia, with 1 in 3 being covered by exposure to intensive exposure to technology. But probably you know already that Sweden has somehow been trying to backtrack from that. The key premise of the 2023 report that was launched in July last year was a reminder that for at least countries, low and middle income countries that aspire to improve their education, they aspire to achieve what high income countries had already achieved well before the advent of the digital age. So children can learn without technology. So that's an important reminder, just to take a step back. What is it that we are really trying to achieve? So the first question and the premise of the report was that the first thing we need to ask is, what are the education problems we're trying to solve? And we classify those in 3 groups: issues of equity, access, and inclusion in the broader sense; quality, which I explain how we differentiate; and efficiency. But we need to specify exactly what these education problems are before we proceed to see whether technology is a solution to them. Now, AI, we were, of course, overwhelmed as towards the closing stages of the preparation of the report by the advent of ChatGPT and the publicity it got. And of course, it was one of the latest technologies to be touted with a transformative potential. Practically, if you want to know how we saw it, we treated it as just another technology, even though we're aware of its potential to be really transformative, but it's still a potential. The multiple uses, I'm sure you have discussed: the personalized tutoring, the immersive learning, which is also important for TVET, expanding some of these opportunities, which you may not have discussed, the marking, the lesson planning that can potentially be supported, routine research activities in higher education can be also facilitated. But the major challenges, and challenges both as seen as also engaging challenges, not necessarily negative challenges, but also risks, with assessment and plagiarism, with algorithm abuse, which is a little bit what the little cartoon there tries to remind us, trust, and the news that we receive that also affect education, privacy, written language, the threats, the potential threats, given that oral language may be taking over written language, and what that means is, of course, a major concern. But also curriculum orientation. I think Lynn also mentioned that. What is it that we would need to teach from now on, and how are our education systems going to adjust? But national AI strategies are emerging, and yet they still seem more focused, and I think that was also a message in your presentation, on capacity development, how countries can attract talent to develop AI, but very little in terms of use in education, use for teaching and learning. And that means, or it's probably caused by the fact that, which is not specific to AI, but is about technology in education more generally, that good impartial evidence on education is very rare. That's partly because of the speed of technological development. If we think that the average product changes every 3 years, you know that this is more or less the cycle of a research program. So by the time you have reached your research, the world has moved on. And as a result, technology is being adopted with very limited evidence. Just in one of the examples of the countries that do champion the use of evidence in everything they do, only 7% used rigorous research findings, and only 1 in 5 of the products had been subject to any type of academic research before they were rolled out, and that's the case with the United Kingdom. So a lot of the evidence, as we know, and that was also implied earlier, is coming from the very companies that are trying to sell it. So that therefore some of these findings have been challenged by independent assessments that were not subject to the influence of the technology generators. On equity, of course, there are issues that are very powerful with technology in education and AI as well. I think the case of learners with disability is perhaps the most transformative and one we forget, how technology has really changed the opportunities of these learners. But there are, of course, issues of content generation that are facilitated by technology, adaptation, access and distribution, textbooks that can really be, the cost can be drastically reduced, which is extremely important for some parts of the world. But we shouldn't forget that online content is mainly produced globally by a few dominant groups, and that means also a few dominant languages. 92% of even the common resources, the OER common resources, content is in English. And there is an interesting issue of digital sovereignty. Sovereignty is a contested issue wherever one discusses, but it is really important for education when we think of how do we make the content of education appropriate for our learners. Higher education is, of course, the sector that has been affected most and where most of the research comes through, and it's the availability of platforms is also changing and challenging universities' role, and I think that's really important to remember. On quality, I mentioned that quality issues exist, of course, in education, and technology can be a solution, but the message of the report was not to assume that technology has a blanket effect on all types of education issues that we have. One thing that is very important we did in the report was we separated 2 issues of education. Learning about technology, and no one denies that this is necessary, from learning through technology. And I would say there is a tendency to conflate the two and therefore mislead a little bit the direction of our education systems. I would say one can happen without the other, but we tend to forget about that. So the key message of the report is that some education technologies can improve some types of learning in some contexts. So I think it's important to think in those terms rather than to apply a brush across everything. So it can greatly increase access to resources. It can fill quality gaps in certain cases. It can increase practice time, especially with AI, personalized instruction. It can help engage some learners for as long as the novelty lasts, because by now already maybe it's less novel, and so even that advantage may be lost. But it can be detrimental if excessive. Some of you may have heard about the report, not necessarily directly, but indirectly, because a lot of the debates that happened recently about the use of mobile phones in schools actually was triggered by the report, because the media took the report and spun a little bit its message. We didn't quite say ban phones, but we said that 1 in 4 countries already, through their laws and policies around the world, are banning or putting limits to the use of smartphones in school, and that caused quite an interesting debate in many countries. But our message was focus on learning outcomes, not on digital inputs. We know the millions of laptops that were given early on and continue to be given in many parts of the world, but these have had by themselves no impact. And on the contrary, we see results from assessments. I think the PISA findings are quite interesting this year, because a lot of attention focused on the impact of the pandemic. And I think even in the OECD language, it's fair to say that although the effect of exposure on social media, on devices, is being given some more attention at last, and the negative association, I think the negative trends in learning outcomes are now 10 years old. So there's a 10-year trend of declining outcomes. It's funny because in our world, in the world we operate, we talk about the learning crisis in the world's poorest countries, and it's true, lower levels are very, very low. But actually, if we think that crisis is some issue where things are deteriorating, the only part of the world where learning outcomes are deteriorating is high income countries, and it's difficult to avoid the assumption that perhaps technology is one of the key factors behind that. So we keep arguing that technology does not need to be advanced to be effective, it needs to mature, and I think that was the point about the speed. We need to incorporate things because precisely as was expressed so clearly, and I couldn't agree more, these technologies are hardly ever designed to be applied in education. So it needs a lot of incorporation and a lot of thinking and a lot of inputs and feedback from educators and students for that. I used an example there from China where simple broadcast lessons were done with TV 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and they had a massive impact. They reduced urban-rural gaps because the issue was improvement of rural teaching, which was a major problem. So technology, simple technology was adapted to a specific problem, and it had a massive effect that hardly any digital technology can even aspire to come anywhere near. So it's important to think of simple technologies for improvement. On efficiency, we have, of course, a lot of promise there. Teacher education costs in some parts of the world can be drastically reduced, and although the effectiveness is not as high, the efficiency gains are so large that can justify the use, and even informal exchanges, of course, with professional learning communities. But when it comes to adaptive assessments and computer-based assessment, again, there's a lot of promise, but not yet enough evidence of how effective it has been. And it's a debate that requires a lot of more exchange. There's a lot of promise on learning and analytics, but somehow the skills that are required to process this data by educators, but even by administrators, have been underestimated, underappreciated in order to fulfill that task, let alone, of course, the issues of data sets integration or of privacy, which remain very, very significant. Now, technology is often presented as a way of filling a gap, and yet we know that it is really, there's a lot of wastage. In the United States, around 2/3 of education software licenses bought by schools were not used, and that is a reminder of how much money is actually wasted when it should be used for actual problems that we currently have in education. And again, coming from our perspective, which is global, but we have a particular interest in low middle-income countries, there's a large financing gap to achieve basic national targets, which is not even universal education. Introducing very, very soft digital transformation interventions, offline solutions in the poorest countries, school connectivity in lower middle income countries would increase the cost by 50%, the gap by 50%. So we have moral issues there about what we can promote to countries that don't have resources. The report, every edition of the report is accompanied by a website which we call Peer, where we document through desk-based research and some validation by countries where possible, their approaches through their laws and policies on the theme of the report. And you see here from this graph indicatively some of the policies that we have documented. Only 16% of countries guarantee data privacy in education. Only 19% regulate the use of personal devices in schools. So you can find some interesting, and the finding on banning phone use also came from that research. So coming closer now, because I see time is passing, we approach the, because of course everyone talks about education and technology, and it was very challenging for us to have a distinct voice on what we wanted to say. We approach this with 4 tensions that appear in education. Personalization and adaptation is a great promise, but that should not make us forget the importance of the social dimension of learning together. The more you individualize, perhaps the more you lose rather than the more you gain. There's a promise of inclusion for some groups is really critical, and maybe we have not even invested enough in that, but at the same time, exclusion is rife. There's a lot of commercial interest. We should not forget the common good. There are some short-term efficiency gains, but the long-term costs that I'm going to refer to in a minute. So we have this compass of 4 calls to governments, because our reports tend to address governments, how to approach education technology investments, what to ask themselves. So we said they need to ask whether this technology, a specific technology, not all technologies, is appropriate, is equitable, is scalable, and is sustainable. So I'll take you quickly through these 4 recommendations as I conclude. On the appropriateness, we stressed the need to strengthen education systems and align them with the learning objectives that these systems have. Curricula obviously would need to be changed if the potential of technology where it exists is to be realized, but it needs to incorporate a clear understanding of how students learn, and we know that we have many questions still about how students learn and how they can make use. But already AI-based systems of teaching have proven in the United States not to be more effective than traditional teaching. So a lot of evidence is required, and for that we need to design anything new with the support of teachers and students. And yet, even senior leaders, a minority of leaders in the United States had been consulted before such investments were made. And we need to ensure the solutions are designed to fit the context, and that means, of course, teacher education. And yet, according to the last tallies, which already dates to 2018, but still, that review had shown that 43% of teachers in lower secondary schools had felt prepared to use technology for teaching even after they had been trained. The second set of recommendations relates to equity, leaving no one behind. It was expressed. Unfortunately, there is a clear tendency to promote dominant cultural norms, which makes education not only less appropriate, but also less equitable. We have a recommendation on targets on internet connectivity, less relevant, of course, for you, although, of course, Europe has its own even higher level targets. But it's important to remember the need for digital public goods, and that's a contested terrain that your policies are constantly engaging with. And of course, European countries are leading the way for the rest of the world, how some of these questions need to be addressed. Scalability is a reminder that so many of the decisions are being taken without evidence or through pilots that are very short-term. Very few countries have national bodies that evaluate on a systematic way the effectiveness of technology. In the United States, where there is a clearinghouse, federal clearinghouse of different products, independent assessment of the evidence that was there showed that only 2% of the more than 10,000 products that were documented or registered there had evidence of impact that was strong or moderate. So that is a reminder that other countries are moving in the dark. Now, of course, the costs are very high, but that's why it's important for countries to coalesce and find ways to collaborate, because no single country can afford the cost of testing the effectiveness of these technologies. We need to remember that the total cost of implementation of technology is much higher than the original costs. Average estimate is that we only know a quarter of the eventual cost, so that's a reminder of the trap that sometimes exists in these investments. And we need to also ensure the transparency of these investments and be aware of the capacity gaps, especially in decentralized contexts where a lot of these decisions are being shifted to schools that have even less of a capacity to take the right decisions for these technologies. Finally, sustainability, and of course I mentioned already the economic sustainability, but there are also other types of sustainability. A key message of the report, as we discuss issues, and that's relevant for AI as well, is that we often think of digital skills as something technical. And yet evidence from the use of assessments like TEAMS or like PISA reminds us that learners with better, or at the top 20% of reading skills were 5 times less likely to be duped by phishing emails or by misinformation. And that is such an important message to retain, that actually at the end of the day, maybe what we need is not necessarily technical digital skills, is ensuring the quality of our education systems, because if we ensure that learners come out, even the disadvantaged learners, with strong literacy and numeracy skills, and of course the other soft skills that are necessary to bolster them and make their use more efficient, then we're more than halfway where we need to be, because these learners would know how to navigate digital landscapes and of course the AI challenges. We need to protect learners and teachers' human rights, well-being, safety and privacy. Privacy is of course a high concern with AI as well. 9 in 10 products that were reviewed, education technology products that were reviewed during the course of the COVID pandemic were found to be collecting children's data. And of course now the EU has put an end to that, but if we think in global terms, that's a major challenge. We should not allow education to be used as a channel for other means and other objectives. And last but not least, and I'm not sure if that was discussed yesterday, there are also massive environmental implications. I would just say the traditional example of expanding the lifespan of laptops by a year in the EU would be equivalent of taking 1 million cars off the road, but AI is massively expanding the environmental implications from the data use for really no particularly clear objective positive outcome from that, and we have to be very, very cautious of how we expand. So to conclude, the message of the report was that technology should be on our terms, which is of course difficult, but we need to remember that we need to keep the learner's best interests at the center of a framework based on human rights. Remember to focus on outcomes, what we really want to achieve in education, not just on the inputs. And the message that I think probably also echoes with all of you is that digital technology should not be a substitute for, but a complement to human interaction. Now, how we're going to achieve that is a question, but I'm sure that will come next in the discussions on the engagement of teachers with AI. So thank you very much for the invitation, for the attention.
So thank you very much, Manos, for this very rich presentation that draws a good picture of the links between technology and, as you said, quality, equity, and efficiency. And some of your words of caution and attention will echo to the presentation of yesterday and the question of the audience. Personally, I've written one key point that you have to say, except the last sentence that you told, but the key point for me is some education technologies can improve some types of learning in some context. And thinking AI or digital technology in a general point of view is very dangerous. So we have, as we say, we have not so much time, so the floor is to your questions now. 1, 2, 3, 4, don't know, but it depends on two questions. The floor is yours. Okay. And
thank you, Manos, for this wonderful presentation. It struck me that this report is more critical than I'm used from reading reports. Most reports on technology are quite optimistic about results, are about increasing capacity more and more, and this is another report. So I'd like to know how you look to that. Is this a new kind of approach?
Another question? No. Yeah.
I think it's very recognizable, especially the difference or the unalignment in speeds of development. If you look at technology and educational dynamics, is there ever a way education can come ahead of those developments and play a pivotal role in creating content, be a crucial partner in the development of these technologies? and what is needed to make sure that happens. And perhaps you can give us an advice, because we're all advisory councils, and I'm sure there's a role for us to play in, but if you can reflect on that, please do.
So briefly, I think it is probably fair to say that especially international reports tend to be a bit more sanguine, as we say, about technology. Although in reality, having seen this from, I mean, you have to remember, that's why I gave the introduction, right? Our report is editorial independent. So we really write what we think, and we're a team of essentially 8-10 researchers that write this report internally. We don't have any influence on our role. So that's very important. But having observed organizations from the inside, I think it's fair to say that in every organization there is this struggle. And at the end of the day, it's who has the upper hand in conveying a message. You would be quite interested in, when it comes, for instance, to the OECD, I have been very surprised that even though there's such strong evidence to raise questions, still the PISA report was, the 2022, was followed by a report on digital education a couple of months later. And there were two different worlds. The report on digital education was very, very optimistic and positive without any evidence whatsoever, even though there was plenty of evidence in the PISA study to raise questions. I would say in UNESCO the same thing is happening. And you would probably be surprised to know that our report was not as critical as another report that UNESCO published shortly afterwards. In fact, it's quoted in the report. It was entitled "The EdTech Tragedy," with a question mark. And it reflected specifically on the experience of the COVID years. So that's how we managed to, because you don't want to have two reports. But that report was even more critical. We try to be a little bit, take a step back and recognize, as we try to do, because we want the reports to be read by everyone. We don't want people to close a report before just by seeing the title. We had the same issue with the previous report, which was on private education, the role of non-state actors. We want to make sure everyone reads it and nobody puts it in the bin just because of its cover. I think we just have to serve the interests of countries. That's the main driver for us. And because we have a global responsibility, we just want to be very, very careful in what we say. And we've seen very much with evidence-driven, not to an extreme, because of course evidence sometimes, not everything can be measured, and some things that are very important you just can't measure, but that doesn't mean you should not be talking about them. But yes, we just try to strike a middle road and bring people together for useful discussions and not keep people apart. I think that's what is the motivating factor behind most of our reports. Now, on your question, I mean, the report, and that was a weakness, it's the report on technology and education. For us, every theme, we have to be careful to grab the opportunity and talk about very different ways of approaching a theme. And here we were, unfortunately, driven by the interests of people who want to hear about the impact of technology on education. But there is the reverse direction, the impact of education on technology, which, if you ask me, frankly, it's far more important than the other way around. So we only dedicated a chapter to that, just because it was not possible. It's already a very, very bulky report to have to deal with all these issues. But this is the answer, I think, to your question. Education is ahead of all these developments. Maybe not for its own benefit, but for the benefit of development in general. So let's not forget that aspect. And also what we can do to improve this development. Now, every global report has a youth edition, and it also has a gender edition. We launched in last month the gender edition of the report, which focused on the impact of algorithms a little bit on social media and the impact on learners, and especially girls. And I think here is an interesting way of thinking about it. Girls are doing better than boys in education almost globally. Definitely in reading, but even in mathematics is parity. But they're not doing as well as boys at the high levels of performance of mathematics and science. There's actually quite large gaps still remaining. And that has a trigger effect. Of course, it's caused by mathematics anxiety among girls. It's caused by biases at home and at the school. And that continues. Girls are, of course, they have a comparative advantage in the non-scientific fields. Comparative, it's in economic terms, comparative, not that they could not do as well elsewhere, but they have an extra advantage there. So they are less likely to register in courses, STEM courses. In fact, the statistics that we showed in this report, which are very interesting and they have not been published for quite some time, show that there has been no change in the share of girls studying STEM in the last 10 years. There are some exceptions. I think the Netherlands are an example of progress, which is quite rare. And that perpetuates even lower graduation rates and even lower entry into positions of STEM in businesses. And then we should not be surprised when we see that algorithms, and even less women are in AI positions, we should not be surprised that the algorithms are actually biased against women at the end of the day. They are the ones that have, young girls have been suffering more than boys from being exposed to those. If only education could ensure that we have more gender balance in these domains, then we could possibly have much stronger impact also on how education can be ahead of the developments.
So, bravo. Once more, thank you very much, Manos, for your presentation and your answers. Keep your independence and objectivity. It's precious.
We need your support for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.